So after the release of Metal Gear, Konami knew that they had a new hit on their hands. The sales for the MSX release of the game are unknown, but the NES port sold well over 1 million copies, so of course, Konami wanted to get to work on a sequel as soon as they possibly could. So Kojima got to work with the team on the MSX follow-up. Meanwhile, an entirely separate team was tasked by Konami with making their own sequel to release on the NES, without Kojima or any of the main team being involved. This game would also be made specifically for the Western market, with the game never even being released in Japan. So how did Snake's Revenge turn out, both as a sequel to the original, but also as a standalone product, and how does it hold up today? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the second in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the first video in order to enjoy this one, you'll be missing a lot of important context about my journey with that game if you haven't seen it, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below if you want to go check that out first. But with that out of the way, Snake's Revenge is a stealth action-adventure video game developed and published by Konami in 1990 for the Nintendo Entertainment System. But let's start by answering the question a lot of you likely have. Why are we covering Snake's Revenge as the second game in the review series? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. When I do these series, I always cover the games in release order, and Snake's Revenge actually released to the public 3 months before the actual sequel, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. So if you were an avid fan at the time, chances are you actually would have played Snake's Revenge first. With that being said though, it's important to note right off the bat that as Kojima had nothing to do with this game, as well as conflicts with what would eventually be released in Metal Gear 2, Snake's Revenge is not the canon sequel and is seen more as a spin-off by the Metal Gear fandom nowadays. Regardless, Snake's Revenge takes place 3 years after the events of the original Metal Gear, when Foxhound discovers that an unnamed nation in the Middle East may have recovered the plans for Metal Gear and are attempting to reproduce it. Naturally, they send in the man best equipped to deal with the situation, Solid Snake, along with 2 other operatives named John and Nick. And let me just ask, what happened when naming these 2? In the first game, we had names like Solid Snake, Big Boss, Dr. Drago Petrovich, and now we just get John and Nick. Anyway, we get sent in with John getting captured roughly 5 minutes into the game, and Nick just not really being seen for the majority of it, so we're effectively on our own again, much like the first game. The team also decided to start the player out in the jungle for this game, which brings us into the first, and one of the biggest ways that the team tried to build upon the foundation of the original. The first game took place entirely inside of various buildings, with there being one small outdoors section where you have to cross the desert, but here in Snake's Revenge, the environments are much more varied. Like I said, you start in the jungle before going through a couple of buildings reminiscent of the original game, then a docks area, a cargo ship, a moving train, and more. And it definitely helps that they change the color schemes of these areas as you move through, helping them feel visually distinct from one another, at least as much as you really could on the NES. And the soundtrack here is also pretty great. The first game's tracks were also really good, but the full OST for that game is 13 minutes long. This game has a lot more tracks compared to the original, this OST being 22 minutes long, but seriously, it was very noticeable in the first game when the same 2 tracks played on loop for almost the entire experience, whereas here you get a lot more variety as you move through the game. It might not be a staggering amount of variety, but it's a hell of a lot better than the first game, and if you're looking to listen to some 8-bit music, you could do a lot worse than this. But with what little presentation talk we can have out of the way, how does the game play? Well, one of the very first things I noticed in my playthrough is that the developers gave Snake a knife this time. This means that you no longer have to punch an enemy 3 times to take them out with melee, you can just hit them once with the knife and be on your way. The only thing that's weird about this is that punching is still an option, and it's also the default option. Meaning that every time you die and load back into this game, you'll have to open your inventory and select the knife again. So let me ask you the question, If you have 2 weapons and one kills enemies in 3 hits while the other kills them in 1, what reason do you have to ever use the weaker of the 2? I don't know why punching is even still an option, and beyond that, I really don't know why I have to manually change back to the knife every single time I load a checkpoint. Regardless, fans of the original Metal Gear will be glad to know that the formula of that game is completely intact here. You show up with almost nothing, start exploring to collect items and keycards to open up new ways to progress, rescue hostages to rank up, avoid detection to make things easier on yourself, the whole shebang. That being said, one thing that was also carried over was the item farming thing that I mentioned in the first video. And I don't know how I never thought of this while writing that video's script, but some of you in the comments mentioned that item pickups should have just filled it up to your maximum capacity, and I 100% agree. Like I said then, it's not exactly my idea of fun to run in and out of a room for a minute straight just to fill up to capacity on an item before progressing, and with the entire game being balanced around the idea of you always carrying as much as you can, why not just make the lives of the players easier? Of course, the answer, much like with the original game, is one of 2 options, where it's either just because quality of life wasn't a big priority back in the day, or it's to pad out the game's length, which was also very common in the late 80s and early 90s. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that this particular part of the game's formula still really bugs me, and I hope that they get it worked out pretty quickly in the next couple entries. And of course, stealth is still going to be the best approach in this game. Much like the first, when you're spotted, you'll be outnumbered, outgunned, and also like that game, the enemies are better shots than Snake is, being able to shoot diagonally and occasionally through surfaces, whereas the player can only shoot in the cardinal directions. The player's bullets are also very short range, whereas the enemy's bullets can cover the entire screen, only adding to that effect. And that brings me to a major difference between this and the original, and that's that this game is hard, like flat out sadistic. The enemy AI is a little less predictable than in the first game, with there being some variation in what directions they'll face at certain points in their patrol patterns, meaning you'll get caught off guard a lot more. And the most noticeable thing about this game's difficulty is that there are way less healing items in this game. In the first, you'd be able to consistently find a room with some rations in it to be able to farm when you get low, but in Snake's Revenge, there are only about 3 or 4 of those rooms in the entire game, meaning you're kind of just thrown to the wolves and expected to get through like 80% of the experience with no healing items. I learned late into the game that these could be farmed from enemies using melee kills, so that alleviated some of the pressure near the very end, but since it's not something that's ever taught or hinted at, I assume that most players will never know about this. And even if you do know about it, it's a pretty low drop rate, maybe somewhere around 10%, so if you're trying to fill up to say 10 healing items from empty, you could sit there farming an enemy for like 100 kills just to get that. And believe me when I say that those numbers are not very far off, because I personally did that a couple times. And for whatever reason, your rations won't be used automatically when equipped anymore like they were in the first game, meaning that you have to manually open your inventory and use them every single time you're close to death, which will be a lot in this game. Or at least it would be if there were a suitable amount of healing items to balance the difficulty. While we're on the topic of the difficulty though, the opening area of the game is particularly brutal, with you having no light to navigate the jungle with. You can't see where you're going, and on top of that, the enemies are using spotlights to look for you, and if even a tiny bit of your player's sprite touches a spotlight, it's an instant full alert that, since you have no upgrades or items yet at this point in the game, will either kill you or leave you very close to death. Areas like this are very common in this game, and you can trust that I'll probably talk about 1 or 2 more by the end of the video. Another iconic feature of the first game returns with the codec, but they've made a pretty large change to it here. Rather than having the player manually turn into the frequency of whoever you're trying to reach out to, they simply have a list of contacts for you to select from this time. And honestly, I'm of 2 minds on this one. I think it's really charming that they had you remember the frequencies yourself in order to continue to contact individuals in the story, but I also recognize the convenience of just being able to say, I want to call John, and being able to call John. I know that a lot of people probably have a strong opinion one way or the other, but honestly, when it comes to how they decide to use the system going forward, I won't be disappointed either way. On the topic of returning features, let's talk about the keycards real quick. Some of you might remember in the last video when I complained about the fact that all cards are separate and the game required you to use the exact card for every door rather than just leveling up a single key card that could get you through all levels you had acquired. Well, don't worry, because that didn't change here. It's the exact same problem here, but it's even worse due to the game being played on an NES controller rather than a keyboard. Instead of changing cards taking 3 button presses like in the original, it now takes 5, and rather than the inventory menu instantly opening and closing, there's now a small animation for going in and out, meaning that swapping through your key cards only takes longer than in the original game. I sincerely hope that this gets worked out in the next couple games, because man does it get annoying, especially near the end of the game when you're sitting at every single locked door you come across for 30 seconds flipping through your 8 different keys. But let's talk about something new for a change. Snake's Revenge adds in these side-scrolling sections that you'll see roughly 10 times throughout the game's story, and these completely change the way the game plays. You'll have to crawl to avoid the enemy's line of sight, swim through water, avoid a variety of traps that are made specifically for these sections, and more. At first, I absolutely hated these sections because I thought that you could only use the knife during them, and it felt like there were a ton of moments where it was impossible to avoid detection. But I later realized through accidentally pressing the select button during one of these segments that you can actually equip your pistol, and suddenly they got a lot better. Who would have thought that knowing how to play a game made it more enjoyable? These sections can get pretty frustrating, especially near the end of the game where a lot of the time they feel like they're just testing how many healing items you're willing to farm beforehand, but I have to admit that they do help a lot with the pacing of the game by changing things up so much, so it's an interesting addition that I'll say is pretty alright overall. Also returning from the original game are the boss fights, and this time, these guys really aren't messing around. Due to the lack of healing items for most of the game, you'll have to essentially master the mechanics of every boss to be able to pass them, and they can get pretty brutal. My personal favorite was one where there were 3 soldiers behind walls tossing grenades over the top of them, so the player has to run around the flurries of grenades and find the right moments to throw their own grenades back over the walls. Much like the original game, there's a good amount of variety to these bosses, and I might say that these were generally better than those found in the original, since it's a lot more difficult to cheese these fights compared to the first game. And also, if we can all just be real with one another for a minute, topping those bosses is not exactly the hardest achievement. Secrets behind walls have also returned, and once again, they're a bit of a mixed bag. Much like the first, they are 100% mandatory to progress through the game, and as I said in the last video, I'm not a huge fan of that, but there is a new item called the X-ray lens that will allow you to see these weak walls so that you know where to plant explosives and open up new pathways. The big problem here is that the game never explains this to you. In the previous game, it locks you into a square box before Big Boss tells Snake over the codec that he should look for vulnerabilities in the walls, tutorializing the mechanic for the player in a space where it is basically impossible for the player to mess it up. But in Snake's Revenge, nothing of the sort happens, just kind of handing you the item and hoping you'll figure it out for yourself. But in my opinion, that's not even the biggest missed opportunity with the X-ray lens. This game also brings back the floor traps from the first game that will instantly kill the player if stepped on, but unfortunately, the X-ray lens can't reveal these to the player. There are some areas in the game that just have floor traps everywhere, so I feel like allowing the X-ray lens to reveal these traps would have made it much easier and much less frustrating for patient and observant players to progress through these areas. I definitely feel like that could have made the item more useful overall, as well as making some of the more annoying parts of the game go by much quicker, so I'm not really sure why the developers never added that functionality. Now, so far, you might notice a general pattern of this game being a lot like the original, but with some things being slightly better and a lot more things being slightly worse. But this next one is, well, it's actually kind of both. The pacing in this game is just weird. On one hand, things like the item swapping taking longer, the obscene amount of traps, and the increased difficulty make the pacing here so much worse than the first game. But on the other, you've got things like the increased variety of the environments, the side-scrolling segments, and some smaller things that I haven't even mentioned yet, like the Frogger sections or riding gondolas to get between buildings, improving the pacing drastically. They even added a 5th and a 6th level to the player rank to make sure that your progression continues further into the game without just stretching out the time between each rank increase. Overall, I would say that the pacing is about on par with the first game, and if you're familiar with the saying 2 steps forward, 1 step back, This is more like 3 steps forward and 3 steps back. But now, let's talk about the Metal Gear franchise's claim to fame. That wacky story. Like I said at the beginning, this takes place 3 years after the original game, and we go in to ensure that this unnamed Middle Eastern nation isn't capable of reproducing Metal Gear. When we get there, John gets himself captured so that we can slip into the base unnoticed, and from this point on, we're on our own. We find out along the way that the militia's weapons are being stored in the bottom of a cargo ship, so we infiltrate the ship, and sure enough, there are numerous Metal Gears being stored here. And the developers exercised a surprising amount of restraint with this moment too. They didn't immediately have someone call you on the codec and go, "Oh my god, they've been mass producing Metal Gears." They just have you walk through the room on your own and put it together for yourself. Anyway, we blow up the ship, but before we can leave, we need to rescue John. So along the way to rescue him, we learn that the militia also has plans to develop a Metal Gear 2. No, not the game, Kojima was already on that, but a revision on the original weapons design, so we now have to also ensure that they can't complete that project. We get to John on the train, and he reveals to us that he was a spy the entire time, and that he wasn't expecting us to get this far in the first place. We battle with John, killing him, and continuing on to find the plans for Metal Gear 2. Along the way, we hear mentions of Big Boss, which of course can't be true as we shot him with rockets and left him behind in the self-destruction of Outer Heaven in the last game. But of course, it is true, and we run into him near the end of the game. Snake blasts him with a ton of rockets again before he suddenly bursts out of his jacket and reveals that he's now a cyborg with no weaknesses. Except for earlier when I learned that he has weak spots on the soles of his feet. So after a short chase sequence, I drop a bunch of landmines at his feet, which eventually leads to him being killed for real this time, before an announcement comes over the speakers that Metal Gear 2 is ready to fire and will be doing so momentarily. So we rush to the facility housing Metal Gear 2, and when we get there, we're completely blocked off from it. But just when all hope is lost, I have 80-some remote-controlled rockets remaining, and there just so happens to be a winding vent with opening and closing shutters. So I start attempting to get the rockets through this vent, which is a painfully frustrating endeavor, but eventually I manage to get enough of them in to destroy Metal Gear 2, and then it's over. Big Boss is dead, the mass-produced Metal Gears are destroyed, and the Metal Gear 2 prototype is destroyed just before it can devastate most of the world's major cities. And one last thing to note is that the localization for this game was a little iffy. It was a game made exclusively for a Western release, but of course the Konami developers were still in Japan, so it was originally written and made in Japanese before being translated to English. But from what I know, the original Metal Gear's translation was also terrible. I just happen to have played the version available on GOG, which was retranslated and released in 2006, so it wasn't an issue for my playthrough. And it's not that it's terrible here, but most of the time it's off by just enough that native English speakers will notice that things sound weird. To bring up one specific example, a microphone that you find near the end of the game is called Hidden Mic. So yeah, enough said. Overall, Snake's Revenge is one of the weirdest games I've ever reviewed. There are some really good evolutions from the original here, but it takes so many steps back that are impossible to ignore. The best way that I can explain my experience with this game is that it felt like I was being gaslit into thinking I was enjoying my time. I would go through an hour or so of absolute bullshit, and just when I was about at my limit, the game would have like a solid 30-minute stretch or so that was actually really good. It's such an up and down experience, and it was really hard to figure out how I feel about the game overall. I do think that the story was actually fairly entertaining, and might even be my high point of the game, but since it was rendered non-canon only 3 months after its release, it's hard to recommend off of that merit alone. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Snake's Revenge a 5.4. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. They start as low as $1 a month and can get you things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. But if you can't afford to, don't worry about it. We've all been there, and your likes, comments, etc. already help out the videos plenty. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you definitely enjoy the rest of my Metal Gear videos, and maybe even another series I recently started doing the exact same thing with the Ace Combat games. So if you're interested, I'll have both of those linked right here on screen.